fun.
The Philippines is an archipelago consisting of 7,641 islands, with the largest being Luzon, home to the capital, Manila. The country's position in Southeast Asia puts it at unique risk, as it straddles the notorious Ring of Fire, which has over 75% of the world's volcanoes and 81% of the largest earthquakes. Along with these ongoing problems, the Philippines has been put in a dangerous position because of the new threat of climate change. The problem which the Philippines now faces is the ever-increasing global temperature, which is caused namely by the combustion of fossil fuels. Global warming has been an international issue for some time, and in the Pacific Ocean, communities have already been inundated and the Philippines remains at extreme risk from rising sea levels. Historically, the Philippines have been affected by super typhoons, such as the recent Haiyan disaster, and these have been tremendous inhibitors on the growth of the country. Climate change also causes increases in flooding, which have been known not only to be devastating but also a facilitator for diseases in Filipino communities. The Philippines sits in a region where typhoons are very frequent, but in recent years, due to global warming, both the severity and occurrences of typhoons and super typhoons are increasing. Since 1947, 5 of the 10 worst typhoons in the Philippines have occurred since 2006. This has a direct link to global warming. The reefs on the coasts are suffering greatly from coral bleaching as well as dynamite fishing. These coral reefs are required to keep storm surges, the precursors to typhoons, at bay, as well as reduce wave energy by 97% on average. The gradual destruction of reefs will leave the heavily populated Filipino coastal communities vulnerable to worse typhoons and more often. Perhaps the more important factor which will influence the danger of typhoons is the sea level increase, which is predicted to inundate areas of the Philippines in 64 of 81 provinces if levels rise by 1 metre. This, according to the National Commission on Climate Change, will negatively impact the lives of 1.5 million Filipinos. Filipino fishery scientist Rafael Guerrero predicts that 70% of coastal municipalities and cities will be affected by this increase and its impact on fish in the region, which are essential to the livelihoods of many fishermen. Guerrero proposes several local solutions, but he states that these are adaptive measures and are not preventative and cannot reverse the dangers. Apart from the damage to local populations via fish levels decreasing and widespread land inundation, the sea level rise will also lead to a major increase in the severity and frequency of typhoons. Typhoons are mature tropical cyclones, and the area that the Philippines sits in, the northeastern Pacific Ocean, receives 1/3 of all tropical cyclones on Earth. Typhoons in the Philippines are well known for the massive amounts of damage they do to property and land, as well as their ability to displace thousands of people, as seen in 2013 when Super Typhoon Haiyan made landfall across the Philippines and parts of China. Its highest wind speed was 315 kilometers per hour, and it is estimated to have done $3 billion US worth of damage. Typhoons of this intensity are rare, but if global warming and its effects are not properly addressed, tragedies such as Haiyan will be commonplace.
The current economic state of the Philippines, although on a fast increase, ranking within the top 30 fastest growing economies of the world in 2015, is still heavily impacted by the damaging effects of climate change, resulting in unemployment and high expenses in damage control. Our economy is separated into 3 sectors: agriculture, hunting, forestry and fishing, industry, and services, which are known as the primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors respectively. The tertiary sector, consisting of services such as real estate properties, financial services, and call centres, has long been the main contributor to our country's gross domestic product, accounting for 52% of the total annual GDP average from 1990 to 2010. By contrast, the secondary sector accounted for 34% of the total annual GDP average from 1990 to 2010, while the primary sector contributed to only 14%. Despite its low contribution to our total GDP, the primary sector, in 2009, employed 34% of the workforce in the Philippines and is estimated to be employing 3/5 of the population living in poverty. In 2016, there were 0.5 million net job losses in the primary sector, and the percentage of the workforce employed in agriculture decreased to 27%. This is, in part, due to natural disasters and weather events that saw the decline of major crop production in this sector. In the first quarter of 2012, production of the major crop of Palay declined by 1.1% due to floods in the Davao province, and the production of sugarcane also declined, following heavy rain in the provinces of Bukidnon, Davao del Sur, and Lanao del Sur. Evidence from global models indicates that farming populations are expected to experience deterioration in their agricultural yields and incomes as a result of climate increase. Estimations suggest that a temperature rise of 3 degrees Celsius could result in yield losses between 5 to 20%, and a rise of 5 degrees Celsius could result in losses of as much as 50%. As the agricultural sector employs such a large percentage of our population, particularly of our population living in poverty, which, as of 2015, accounts for 23.7% of our total population, if production in this sector continues to decline, it could have damaging impacts on our economy, sending locals further into poverty and damaging the livelihood of many hard-working families. The extreme weather events and natural disasters that occur in underdeveloped countries, as previously discussed, have severe repercussions for the economies of these nations, as they live in a self-perpetuating state of vulnerability, susceptible to the damages of extreme weather and lacking the resources or ability to combat this vulnerability. The Philippines in particular suffers immensely from this, and we are ranked the 13th most vulnerable country to climate change worldwide. With a 2015 GDP of roughly $397.7 billion Australian dollars, an average of 5% of that figure is spent on typhoon damages each year. In 2011, approximately $7 billion Australian dollars was spent in typhoon damages alone. It is clear that not only are the effects of climate change damaging the environment, but they are also damaging our economy, costing us immense expenses each year and hindering our agricultural production. If the primary sector of our nation's economy were to collapse, it would have tremendous effects on our economy and the livelihood of our population, creating immense damage to our nation's stability. And despite our economy's rapidly growing status, our susceptibility to the extreme natural effects of climate change could, at this rate, drag us further into poverty, vulnerability, and economic instability.
Many issues of concern for the well-being of the particularly vulnerable people who reside in developing countries are exacerbated by the natural hazards that have intensified as a result of climate change. Close linkages have been shown between poverty and vulnerability to natural disasters and their mutually reinforcing effects. Evidence strongly suggests that the lower a household's income is, the greater the likelihood of being adversely impacted by natural hazards. Climate change threatens to worsen poverty and burden marginalised and vulnerable groups with additional hardships. The livelihoods of poor people are known to be significantly dependent on natural resources, and when disasters disrupt the flow of goods and services provided by these resources, and more generally by the ecosystems, the poor find themselves in a precarious situation. When disasters destroy capital, the poor typically lack access to financial resources to restore this capital to its pre-disaster level. Poverty is prevalent in areas that are more susceptible to high variability in temperature and rainfall, and these low-income households and communities often have limited access to adequate information to make informed decisions pertaining to climate change and its projected impacts, as well as limited influence on policy-making processes. Ranked at 118th of 188 countries in the Human Development Index, the Philippines is severely impacted both directly and indirectly by climate change. In a country where nearly a quarter of the 100 million person population lives in poverty, and nearly half of that figure unable to meet basic food subsistence needs on any given day, climate change has a severe implication on human life. Of the 17 regions in the Philippines, only one is not vulnerable to rising sea levels. Currently, 64% of the population reside along the coast, where economic growth lags considerably and instances of underemployment and poverty are high. In these areas, families typically reside in shanty palm thatched housing or in small slum-like dwellings constructed from recycled scrap metal and plastic, which makes them even more vulnerable to the havoc inflicted by climate change and less resilient to withstand the force of tropical storms and flooding, or economically able to rebuild afterwards. With the increasingly stronger storm surges brought about by climate change, the incidence of flooding has increased in frequency and severity, and coastlines are eroding. These factors mean that the homes and livelihoods of the coastal communities that account for well over half of the entire population are threatened. We are now facing a crisis in the Philippines of internally displaced persons, that is, people who have been forced to flee their homes as a result of natural hazards. Of the 3 million people displaced in 2014, 96% of these cases were attributed to natural hazard-related disaster. The chart below displays the instance of new displacement year by year as a result of natural hazards. In May 2009, Professor Anthony Costello of the World Health Organization called climate change the biggest global threat of the 21st century. An Asian Development Bank study on the characteristics of notifiable diseases such as malaria, dengue, and cholera showed an association of up to 58% between health impacts and climate variables. Extreme weather events cause injury, death, water contamination, infectious diseases, and food shortages. Adequate and clean water resources are vulnerable to climate change stress, and the lack of these heightens the risk of diarrhea and cholera in rural and urban areas. Temperature and increased rainfall are also predominant factors in the increase of incidences of waterborne disease. The incidence of leptospirosis, a bacterial infection generally contracted through contact with unclean water, most commonly in the event of flooding, was shown to have increased by 221% over the 2011 to 12 period. While malaria, one of the top 10 causes of mortality in the Philippines, is currently an endemic in 58 out of the 81 provinces in the Philippines, a 30-fold increase over the last 50 years. As previously mentioned, as of 2016, agriculture accounts for 27% of all employed Filipinos, while labour and unskilled workers account for 32% of the total employed population. Farmers and fishermen make up for 12%. Figures from 2009 show that fishermen and farmers are the most vulnerable group in the Philippines, with the incidence of poverty the highest among fishermen at over 40% and of farmers at 37%. The performance and production of the agricultural sector, a sector dependent on water supply and predictable growing seasons, has been hampered considerably by the unusual weather conditions and climate-related phenomena. As an example, heavy rainfall causes significant reduction in crop yield and subsistence agriculture, which may lead to malnutrition, micronutrient deficiencies, or, in more extreme cases, starvation. Possible disruptions in the production process have a flow-on effect in the incidence, depth, and persistence of poverty, as food security will not only affect the farmer and his livelihood, but the urban poor who cannot afford the price increases as a result of less supply. Of course, the impacts of climate change affect the country's GDP. However, the bigger issue is that since the Philippines only imports 11% of their food, many of these communities' livelihoods, homes, and sometimes survival depend on the land. Between 1999 and 2014, based on a self-rated hunger survey, the number of families who rated themselves as hungry rose from 8.3% to 18.3%. with the regions most affected by hunger and food insecurity being rural. In 2013, after Typhoon Yolanda devastated the archipelago, a 52% self-rated food poverty was noted. The UN World Food Programme corroborates this study when in 2014 they documented that 27% of the population in Yolanda-affected areas remains food insecure. The increasing strength and frequency of natural disasters in the Philippines exacerbates issues of landlessness, food security. It aggravates health dilemmas and impacts employment and livelihood of its 100 million people. Evidence strongly supports the hypothesis that the lower a household's level of income is, the greater the likelihood of it being adversely impacted by natural hazards. Given the lack of resources and inadequate access to technology and finances, the the Philippines has a limited capacity to develop and adopt strategies that reduce the country's vulnerability to the changes in climate.
The Philippines has worked at both a local and global scale to address the issues of climate change through adaptation and mitigation measures that complements policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Philippines' global policies have been centered around their role as chairman of the Climate Vulnerability Forum and their addition to the Paris Agreement on Climate Change in March 2017. Philippines' local policies, however, are focused on equipping the nation to deal with the effects of climate change due to the nation being one of the most vulnerable nations to climate-related hazards. The Climate Vulnerability Forum is a collaborative forum for countries vulnerable to climate change, whereby between 2014 and 2015, Philippines acted as the chairman of the forum, representing 48 developing countries. In 2015, the Philippines signed the Manila Paris Declaration, addressing the needs of developed countries to assist the more vulnerable countries technically and financially using renewable energy and energy-efficient technologies. The Manila Paris Declaration outlined several considerations in a bid to tackle climate change, such as long-term temperature goals to hold the increase in global average temperatures to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, global gas emission reductions of at least 70-95% below 2010 levels, countries with major greenhouse gas emissions such as America and China to undertake legally binding mitigation commitments, establishment of a 5-year cycle that will review and increase ambition through regular information by the latest scientific discoveries, and all countries should catalyze low-emission and climate-resilient investments to domestic and international levels. Prior to the end of their residence as chairman of the Climate Vulnerability Forum, Philippines has continued to address the issues of climate change at an international level, as evident by the addition to the Paris Agreement on Climate Change in March 2017. In joining the agreement, the Philippines aims to work towards improving local measures in handling the effects of climate change due to their vulnerability. The Philippines outlined the following aims. The Local Climate Change Commission will guide and encourage the government units to complete their local climate change action plans within 2017. Philippines will have access to the Green Climate Fund, which is a fund where developed nations are obliged to gather $100 million annually to support vulnerable and low-emitting nations in facing the effects of climate change. Local government units will have access to international climate funds, and Philippines' local government units will be encouraged to reduce their carbon emissions, limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees, and begin the search for renewable energy sources. The Philippines is able to implement measures to address the devastating effect of climate change upon their nation through the People's Survival Fund and the World Bank grant. The People's Survival Fund is sourced from the national budget at $1 billion and is directed towards establishing regional centers and information networks to strengthen adaptation initiatives to develop early warning systems for climate-related hazards. The World Bank grant, however, is an international grant, approving $4.9 million in 2010 for the Climate Change Adaptation Project in the Philippines to develop cost-effective adaptation strategies in agriculture and natural resource management. The most recent local measure towards reducing climate change is the Climate Change Adaptation for Health Strategic Plan, which was implemented from 2014 to 16. The overall policy was to pursue climate change adaptation as the strategic approach in response to the impacts of climate change upon individuals' health. Due to Philippines' low emissions, the nation's policy was focused on initiating responsive adaptation measures and interventions in the healthcare delivery system. The project outlined 4 targets which were then reviewed by the World Bank to assess the success of Philippines' policies. The first was strengthening the environment for climate change adaptation, demonstrating climate change adaptation strategies in agriculture and natural resource sectors, enhancing provision of scientific information for climate risk management, and establishing partnership and project coordination with national government agencies and other stakeholders. In reviewing the success of the Climate Change Adaptation for Health project, the World Bank found that all 4 targets were met. The first, climate change adaptation health policies and framework were translated into guidelines that regional administrators and local governments could understand. The local government units accepted the climate change adaptation measures, such as the establishment of a marine protected area to manage coastal resources damaged by the effects of climate change. They implemented the Enhanced Climate Smart Farmers Field School Resource Manual for farmers to adopt climate smart farming practices, with 800 farmers graduating. A regional climate forecast for 2030, 2050, and 2100 was introduced into project activities, and the work of differing agencies and monthly seasonal forecast information was used to provide climate-informed extension services to farmers. And finally, project steering committees reviewed the climate change adaptation health progress every 6 months, providing updates regarding the success of the policies amongst differing agencies and government units. In 2016, Philippines became the 13th most vulnerable country in regards to climate-related hazards, as opposed to the 8th most vulnerable in 2015. Success was credited to their improved risk management and diminished dependence on the agricultural sector, improved access to clean drinking water, preventing illnesses brought on by floods and drought.
As a nation and representative of 48 other countries affected by climate change, we call on the stakeholders of the summit to take action towards the mitigation of climate change. As a developing country and a small contributor to global carbon emissions, we are restricted in our ability to combat the issues of climate change. Therefore, we ask that this summit legislate a global agreement amongst these nations by which each country commits to a 10% reduction of their carbon emissions by 2025. We also request that the UN reconsider its policy regarding climate refugees due to the extreme conditions and risk within the Philippines. Furthermore, we call on our partners, the Catholic Church, NGOs, and the World Bank, to assist us as a developing nation in partnership with existing frameworks and policies by investing in sustainable farming practices, renewable energy, and reducing the effect of weather events induced by climate change. We ask that those investing in Filipino aid be strategic in your giving, investing in long-term solutions, including holistic land management, infrastructure, healthcare, and food security, to reduce the destruction of severe weather events and further develop sustainable practices within our country. We also ask that the World Bank reconsider their funding framework for the Philippines to allow for further investment in infrastructure and industry. As a nation, we will partner with our stakeholders and trade partners to adapt to the changing weather patterns that have resulted from our changing climate. As a government, we are proposing a national 5-year plan based on modernist development theory to be implemented in the areas of at most risk of succumbing to the effects of climate change. Based on the success of this 5-year trial, we will continue to implement this strategy throughout the Philippines. Our plan begins with investment in our primary industries, who are at most risk of loss due to climate change. These industries include our agriculture and our fisheries. We intend to encourage holistic land management to reduce land erosion and trap free carbon, and intensive farming to make the most of our available resources. Over time, increased productivity within this sector will increase our food security. The second phase involves investment in more secure infrastructure to better withstand the damage caused by severe weather events and reduce the costs associated with rebuilding. This phase will specifically be focused on housing the currently displaced persons and building new hospitals to act as refuge points and enable us to better treat and prevent diseases from spreading due to the increase of water levels. The third phase involves installing a better warning system to increase communication through and during severe weather events. This will be followed by the training of rapid response teams to reduce our reliance on international aid and speed up the process of rebuilding. These adaptations are our methods of risk management, working towards sustainable change. The Philippines shall also continue its investment in renewable energy practices during this period. As a nation and a people, we implore you to understand, climate change is real for us. It is not a choice. It is a fact, it is a problem, and it is a responsibility. It is our nation, but it is your choice. Our country is drowning. Throw us a lifeline before it's too late.